Hello fantastic creatures, I'm Fantasims and welcome to my channel. You guys were so excited on Twitter about the little Millennium Falcon I built, so here is a speed build of me creating it. It took over 5 hours to make and I tried to speed up the footage as fast as I could, so I'll try to keep up and explain what I did. Since I made this for my Black Spire Outpost build, I copied a room from that build onto the lot so that the Millennium Falcon fits perfectly inside. I also used a pre-made circle from my large Millennium Falcon house that I'm working on and sized it down and rearranged the pieces. I'm using the back side of the Strangerville wall vent, and I first rotated it 90 degrees with Twisted Mexie's tool mod, then rotated it on a different axis to create the circle. I usually rotate 36 pieces at 10-degree angles, which is what I did here. Originally I was going to keep this small version of the Millennium Falcon grungy like the big one I'm building, because when Han Solo owned it, he kept it looking run down and junky on purpose so that it could be used for smuggling and no one would suspect. But the one parked in front of the Black Spire Outpost in Disney World and Disneyland's Galaxy's Edge looks a lot brighter, so I decided to use the other side of the wall vent and use the whiter side. With Tool Mod, you can choose Toggle Select before you rotate and hold the Alt key while you click on each item. They turn green and opaque, which is super helpful. Then you hold Shift and click on one of the objects selected and rotate, and it rotates all of them at the same time, which saves so much time when you're building. So I flipped all the pieces over by rotating by 180 degrees. I'm still using the grungy white swatch, but it looks quite bright and shiny compared to the back size. I gave it a 5-degree slope on the top and bottom to give it that slight UFO disc shape that the Falcon has. I simply copied and pasted the room and used Tool Mod to elevate and lower the circles to fit nicely on top of each other. A great tip: every time you rotate objects, save it as a room because it saves you time in the future. I like to use mannequins as well to give me perspective of the size too, and I used debug-based game fire pits to cover the top and bottom of the ship from the parts of the wall vent that are sticking out in the middle. I'm now constructing what looks like the wingtips of the ship, but they are actually not wings. The Millennium Falcon is a freighter ship used to push large space cargo containers, which it grips onto between the two parts at the front that stick out. So the front part of the ship is the freight loading doors, which is why the cockpit is off to the side and you actually board the ship on the left side. At first I tried using the white side of the wall vent object like I did for the body, but the shape was all wrong, so I used the back side instead. The color doesn't match perfectly doing it that way, and that was an issue with this build. But to remedy that, I later blend in more grungy white objects to make it look cohesive rather than patchwork. One thing that made this a bit longer to make is that when you rotate objects that are supposed to lock onto the walls, like this vent, if you elevate them and then decide to reposition them, they drop down to the floor again and you have to re-elevate them, which is a bit annoying. Whereas regular freestanding objects will stay floating in an elevated position, which makes adjusting them a lot faster. Since the wall vents are not debug objects, I could have made a room around them and copied and pasted to duplicate the rotated objects, but I wanted to be able to undo the room because it changed the floor shape and I needed to keep the circle floor so that I could later add it to my build I'm working on. So instead I saved the room to my library and then used the duplicated objects to finish shaping the slope of the front tips. The angle of the slope I believe is 25 degrees, so I needed to create more pieces at that angle to fill in the gaps. I did get confused and first rotated them at 20 degrees, so I had to go back in and fix it. And guys, I know many of you think I'm really good at just making these objects and knowing what I'm doing, and I appreciate that, but in all honesty, I get the math wrong all the time and I have to keep tweaking objects over and over. You guys see the final product, but you don't see all the times I goof it up, which is a lot. I also spend ages staring at the screen trying to problem solve, but that's not included in the footage, so it appears I know what I'm doing the whole time, but I really don't. I hope that you're encouraged by that. But the more I do it, the better I'm getting at guessing what angle I should use, so those of you who are new to the tool mod, it does get easier the more you practice with it. Okay, back to the build. I had to keep repositioning them, and I found aligning them with the outside edge first was way better than starting with the inside edge. I also made sure to position the bottom pieces before placing the top so that I could see what I was doing. Some of the pieces are poking into the body of the ship, but that gets covered later. That's where the problem solving comes in. Most of my best ideas stem from me trying to cover up weird things like objects poking out. Also, I didn't realize until I was done with this build that the left spike sticks out slightly further than the right, but I was not about to reposition all those objects again, so if you have major OCD, you can fix it if you like. I then used debug fire pits again and rotated them upside down and tried to position them at the bottom of the ship, but it would have been so much easier if I would have known I was going to do this at the beginning, because I had to guess where the center is. I think I aligned it correctly in the end. I then tried to add the white side of the vent to the top, but it didn't look as good, so I scrapped that. Then I tried to smooth out the round edges of the ship by using a debug base game protractor that I flipped upside down. I sized it up really big and then flipped it upside down. And I used the same trick on my Cyberpunk Cantina when I created a circular space drink bar, but I later ended up deleting this, not only because the grey colour didn't really match, but also because all the stuff I added on top covered the protractors anyway. Most of the rear of the ship encases the powerful hyperdrive engine, which is twice as fast as the fancy Imperial warships and makes it one of the fastest ships in Star Wars. So it might be considered the ugly old minivan of the Star Wars universe, but it certainly is one of the most powerful. So to encase this massive engine, the rear of the ship lifts up and down slightly, so I copied and pasted the room to duplicate the ship and deleted the front portion of the ship until I was left with a fan shape in the back. I then rotated those pieces up and down by about 5 degrees, then moved the room on top of the original ship. Now, a good trick when you have objects clipping on top of each other is to select every other object and elevate them by 0.005 or 0.01. It moves them slightly but resolves issues of flickering, and in my case here, it creates a more visually appealing pattern on the top. I could have just elevated the back pieces on the original ship instead of making a separate room, but I'm a visual person, so I couldn't figure out how many pieces I wanted to elevate. Thinking back on it as well, the whole back end gets covered with objects, so I could have just deleted the inside layer of wall vents so there'd be less objects used, but you know, things are always clearer in retrospect, aren't they? The engine glows a teal blue, so I first thought of these objects from Get to Work, but the bubbles stay big even when you size it down, so I didn't like the look of that. So then I looked through different lamps and settled on wall lights from Dying Out because they come with an ombre blue swatch, and in live mode I changed each light to glow a teal color as well. Now, creating the curve was a bit tricky. I estimated that the slope on each side of the fan is about 40 degrees, so I rotated 4 lights on either side by 10 degrees, so 10, 20, 30, 40, and I figured that theoretically if I copied and pasted those rotated lamps 3 more times and then rotated each set by 2.5, so the first set 2.5, the second set 5, the third set 7.5, it would fill in the space between the lights I rotated at the 10-degree increments, if that made any sense to you at all. Well, theoretically it was true, but when I arranged them in a curve, I must have put them in the wrong order, which I noticed when I started positioning them on the ship. So I then had to rearrange them again, but I think in the end it turned out great. I didn't film me positioning each light on the ship because it would have taken way too long, so I just filmed me doing a couple of them so you get the gist of what I did. Now, the sides of the ship have an octagonal shape and stick up further than the body of the ship. Like I said before, the left of these octagonal pieces has a loading ramp underneath to board the ship, and the one on the right is used to latch onto other ships. So I used another Strangerville object with the grungy white swatch. I can't remember what it's called, but I rotated it by 90 degrees so the back end is facing up. Then on a different axis, I rotated them in 45-degree increments to get the octagonal shape. I then copied that room and rotated it to mirror on the other side. Then, as always, it was just a matter of tweaking the positioning to make the edges blend together properly. Then I used 2 other Strangerville objects rotated 90 degrees to cap off the front spikes, but it ended up being unnecessary in the end and I could have just used a smaller object. I was just trying to think on my feet, which is not always the best with my brain. Okay, now here is an important trick to keep in mind when you are creating anything, and that is to find ways to blend the same color throughout a build. It makes it feel more uniform and cohesive rather than a patchwork ragdoll, which this ship kind of started to look like. So when I originally set out to make this mini Millennium Falcon, I wasn't planning on putting so much detail on it. I just wanted to give the illusion of a spacecraft for my build, but it just looks so ugly with all the mismatched colors. So the Millennium Falcon actually has a lot of electrical piping and boxes around the edges and all over the front part of the ship. So to give it that illusion of 3D objects around the front end without actually using hundreds of sized down pipes, and to also blend the white of the body into the dark grey of the front spikes, I used the same objects I did for the octagonal side pieces and used the front rounded side to the tops and sides. To make the build faster, I also used these debug white pipes. There are 2 of them that mirror each other and the white antenna tower from Strangerville. It added some variation in shape without me spending ages trying to rotate pipes from Get to Work and City Living. I then needed to create a tunnel that leads into the cockpit that is off to the left side of the ship. So I started off using the debug sewage pipes from Eco Lifestyle, and I found that a 55-degree angle worked perfect for the part of the tunnel that's inside the ship. But it was introducing yet another color that does not really go with the white and grey of the ship. It was too much of a taupe brown, so I changed it later with a different object. The cockpit itself was constructed with the grungy swatch of the plank containment cell from Strangerville. I rotated 2 of them by 90 degrees facing forward, then rotated 1 of them by using the comma key and placed them on top of each other to give that illusion of a rounded shape. To try and blend the different color tunnel into the ship, I used the same trick with the white objects on the top and sides of the tunnel. I didn't like adding so much 3D shape because it can make it look a bit busy, but it was the only way I could think of at the time to blend it into the ship better so that the colors went together. Now I did spend some time off camera to find an object I could use for the tunnel, and I settled on a base game concrete fountain. It has a slight purple tint to the grey, but it was a lot paler than the brown concrete I already had. Also, I rotated the fountains to mirror each other so that it looked like it had grungy seams around the tunnel, which is close to the Millennium Falcon that has vertical seams of metal paneling. I think I resized each piece to be 1.75 with the scaling feature of the tool mod. I made sure they were the exact height off the ground and copy and pasted a room of them to make more, then rotated those pieces by 55-degree angles, and then it was just a matter of aligning them together. The part where they connect was also a bit tricky, but I just made sure to close the gap in the tunnel because I knew the white pieces on top would hide any parts of the tunnel that were sticking out. Now the front of the cockpit is supposed to have windows that you can see out of, but the plank containment cell is solid at the front, so to give the illusion of a window, I used a rotated fountain again and added a window. I later removed that window and inserted a light from Get to Work and changed the light color to blue in live mode, then added the window back. The blue glow of the light helps make the glass parts look more blue than teal. I then added fountains as cap ends to the octagonal parts of the ship, and I rotated another Strangerville object that has the same grungy white swatch, but it took me forever to figure out how much to rotate them to fit the outside curve of the ship, and I ended up overcompensating at first, and it ended up that they only needed to be rotated by 5 degrees, just a very slight angle. But I think they did a great job of tying the side of the ship into the engine. One thing to note is that when you size down the objects that come with a lit electronic display, the display stays the same size, but it ends up looking like a holographic image, which is really cool. And even though the Millennium Falcon doesn't really have holographic lights all around it, I think it's okay because it looks cool. Now at this point in building, I could have just called it a day and finished, but the front of the ship had black edges and didn't flow to the rest of the ship, so I added the back of the grungy doors from Strangerville to act as the cargo loading doors, and then I wasn't sure what else I wanted to do to the front, but I remembered that the Millennium Falcon has 6 large cooling fans above the engine, so I rotated the fans from Get to Work by minus 90 degrees so that they would lay flat on their backs. I rotated the left and right fans on a different axis by I think about 30 degrees, and using the purple-grey fountains throughout the ship helps balance the color and makes it look intentional. I then encased the fans with those scaled down fountains that I used for the tunnel. To cap off the octagonal sides of the ship, I just used a base game smoke detector that I sized up. You might notice all these rooms of rotated pipes. They are actually what I used in my large Millennium Falcon build, and I thought they might be useful for this smaller one, but I only ended up using a couple of the pipes. I just didn't want to put so much detail on this little build. I also excluded footage of me rotating the metal container home doors from Eco Lifestyle because I knew this video would end up being way too long, and I figured by now you kind of get the gist of how I rotate objects. To seal off the sides of the blue engine area, I used the same wall vent object on their sides at I think a 40 or 50 degree angle, I can't remember. I also elevated it by fractions like 0.01 and 0.005 to get it to sit just below the fire pit on top of the ship. I then added another smoke detector rotated on its side to hide the gap at the top. On top of the Eco Lifestyle doors in the back, I added City Living pipes to act as hydraulic flap mechanisms because each of the metal panels on the ship can be elevated or lowered independently. I will say though that rotating the white doors was a bit tricky because I couldn't figure out the angles I needed, and it turned out that the ones closer to the back were rotated in increments of like 2.5, then around the side it jumped to increments of 5 or more, and to be honest I just kept tweaking it until it looked right, so I can't really remember the exact measurements, but I do show you how I copied them to put at the bottom of the ship as well, and I did give them a slope of 5 degrees inward towards the center. Now I'm just adding some finishing touches like the red tractor beam lights at the front of the ship I set to red in live mode, and I played around with debug upgrade parts to give some detail to the front of the ship. At the top of the ship there's a gun, so to recreate it I used the top of a circular light up ad display from City Living, an oversized pipette syringe from the Strangerville debug, and 2 mechanical objects from Get to Work, which I rotated one of them on the side to look like a machine gun. I then added 2 more base game lights that I set to red to give the illusion of a laser. At the front of the ship I wanted to hide the black edges in front of the cargo doors with the Eco Lifestyle doors like I did in the back. It didn't look very realistic with them just sort of sticking out without any mechanism holding them onto the ship, so I added some base game wall vents that I rotated to thicken up the trim and connect to the Eco doors. I placed them above and beneath the door so that it looked good from a Sims viewpoint angle. And the last touches were adding more of the upgraded parts around the front. Really, I just wanted to neaten up those edges, so I end up using them at the top, the front, and the sides. They didn't quite align symmetrically on the sides because the upgrade part computer chip is not symmetrical itself, but if you look at the sides of the Millennium Falcon, not all the gadgets are symmetrical there either, so I think we can get away with it. And since the ship grips onto cargo between the 2 spikes, for lack of a better word, I don't even know what they're supposed to be called, I thought that the upgrade parts kind of look like some sort of gripping device that comes out, or maybe it has a magnetic pull. I just like how the computer chips add a little bit of electronic color to the front of the ship. It makes it feel more active. And the very last thing I did was add a couple more of the white objects I placed on the top and sides of the ship to just smooth out the look of the front. And that's it! After over 5 hours, it was finally done. This Millennium Falcon model is big enough to look like a life-size spacecraft for your Sims, but smaller than it would be to scale so that it can fit on smaller lots. Stay tuned for my big Millennium Falcon that your Sims can actually live inside. So what do you guys think? Is there anything you'd like me to try and create next? Thank you so much for watching this video. Sorry I had to talk so fast to keep up with the footage. I tried to make this video as short as I could without cutting out the steps I took. If you like this video, be sure to give it an encouraging thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be notified about fresh content. Thank you for all the love you guys give me on Twitter and here on YouTube. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you. I love you guys tons and tons.